Greetings, family. This is IMAHKÜS Njinga Okofu Ababio, affectionately known as Mama Africa. Chapter 4, The Return Through the Door of No Return. We ultimately changed that. We continued to work our way slowly through the streets towards the Cape Coast Castle dungeons, savoring the pleasure of being home and interacting with folks along the way. Even though we didn't understand the language, we were still enjoying ourselves while making new friends. Ahead of us loomed this enormous, foreboding structure. The sight caused me to tremble. I almost didn't want to go inside. The outer walls were chipped with a faded and moldy white exterior. The sea had eaten away some of the mortar. It was gray and dismal as we climbed the steep steps, following the sign leading to the reception area. When we entered the reception area of the Cape Coast Castle dungeons, a smallish man with a bright smiling face met us. His name was Mr. Owusu, and he had been working there as a receptionist and sometimes guide for many years. Akwaba, he said, we are happy that you've come home. We don't get many African American visitors, only white people. They come all the time, he continued. We all laughed and told him that we were equally, if not more happy than he was, for we had worked, planned, and saved for years to make this journey. Most of us will be in debt to the credit card companies, Visa and MasterCharge, plus some of us borrowed money from friends who we will have to repay when we get back to our homes in the United States, I told him. But for years, many of us had spoken of Africa, our motherland, and finally, all of our discussions and dreams had become a reality. Please, I said, please, we are so happy to be here with you. Debt be damned. Nothing is greater than this, I said to no one in particular. After introductions were made all around, Mr. Owusu, our guide, began the tour around the castle. Entering the inner part of the castle overlooking a large courtyard, our guide gave us the background history of Cape Coast Castle dungeons. This was one of the more than 60 castle dungeons, forts, and lodges that had been constructed by European traders with the permission of the local rulers, and stretched for 300 miles along the west coast of Africa to store kidnapped Africans until a shipload of enslaved Africans could be assembled. 27 of these houses of misery were located in Ghana. Various European oppressors had occupied the Cape Coast Castle dungeons during the transatlantic European slave trade. It began with the Portuguese in the 1500s, followed by the Dutch, then the Swedes, the Danes, and finally the English, who occupied it in 1665. It remained under their control, serving as the seat of British administration in the Gold Coast, Cape Coast, until they relocated their racist regime to Christiansborg Castle in Accra in 1877. Our next stop was a palaver hall, which means talking, discussing, the meeting place of slave merchants, which also served as a hall used in auctioning off our ancestors. The room was huge, the only light coming from the windows which lined both sides of the walls, one facing the ocean, the other overlooking the town, a bare room echoing the voice of our guide, a haunting echo which reverberated off the walls as the guide explained how they bargained and sold us. When slave auctions were not going on, Palaver Hall was used as a meeting place for the governor, chiefs, and other visitors. We then moved to the governor's apartment in the church, which I felt like burning down, but nothing could prepare me for what we would experience next. We descended the stairs into a large cobblestone courtyard and walked through large double wooden doors which led into long, dark, damp tunnels. The stench of musty bodies, fear, and death hung in the air. There was no noise except the thunderous crashing of waves against the outer walls and the roaring sound of the water. Deeper we walked into large, dark rooms which had served as a warehouse for enslaved African people, awaiting the ships that would take them to the Americas. This was the men's dungeon. As we stood in that large cavernous room, the air was still. The little ventilation that was available came from small openings near the 20-foot-high ceilings. Our ancestors had been kept underground, chained to the walls and each other, making escape impossible. The mood of the group was hushed as several people started crying. They were standing in hell holes of the most horrific conditions imaginable. There were no words to express the suffering that must have gone on in these dungeons. I became caught up, thrown back in time. I was suddenly one of the many who were shackled, beaten, and starved. But I was one of the fortunate souls to have survived the forced exodus from their homelands to be sold, branded and thrown into these hellholes meant to hold 600 people, but which had held more than 1,000 enslaved Africans at one time. The men separated from the women as they awaited shipment to the Americas. According to the guide, the chalk marks on the walls of the men's dungeon indicated the level of the floor prior to the excavation of the floor, which had been built up over years of slavery with feces, bones, and filth. As the guide continued to describe the horrors of these pits of hell, I began to shake violently. I needed to get out of there. I was being smothered. I turned and ran up the steep incline of the tunnel to the castle courtyard, the winds from the sea whipping my face, bringing me back to the present. I couldn't believe what I had just experienced. How could anyone be so cruel and inhuman? Gradually, the others began emerging from the dungeon, subdued looks on their faces, many tear-stained. No one was talking. Following the guide, we proceeded across the massive courtyard and down another passageway to the women's dungeon, a smaller version of the men's dungeon, but not so deep underground. It had held over 300 women at any given time. As we entered that dark, musty, dark room, the sound of crashing waves was like muffled rolling thunder. A dimly lit, uncovered light bulb hung from the ceiling on a thin frayed wire. After standing silently for a time in this tomb, the guide began to lead the group out. I was the last person left in the room when the guide turned and said he was continuing the tour. Please, I said, I'm not ready to leave. Just turn off the light for me, and I will join the group shortly. As the group walked slowly away, the tears would not stop flowing. I dropped to my knees, trembling and crying even harder when the light off. The only light in that dungeon came through one small window near the very high ceiling, reflecting down as though it were a muted spotlight. Darkness hung in every corner. As I rocked back and forth on the dirt floor, I could hear weeping and wailing, anguished screams coming from the distance. Suddenly the room was packed with women, some naked, some with babies, some sick and lying in the dirt, while others stood against the walls around the dungeons. Terror filled their faces. My God, what had we done to wind up here, cramped together like animals? Pain and suffering racked their bodies, a look of hopelessness and despair on their faces, but with a strong will to survive. Oh God, what have we done? to deserve this kind of treatment. Cold terror gripped my body. Tears blinded me, and the screams wouldn't stop. As I sat there violently weeping, I began to feel a sense of warmth. Many hands were touching my body, caressing me, soothing me, as a calmness began to come over me. I began to feel almost safe as voices whispered in my ears, assuring me that everything was all right. Don't cry, they said. You've come home. You've returned to your homeland to reopen the door of no return. Gradually, the voices and the women faded into the darkness. It was then that I realized that some of the screams that I heard were my own. The eerie light beaming down from the window was growing dimmer as day began fading into night. As I got up from the dungeon floor, I knew that I would never be the same again. After years of wandering and searching, I had finally found my way home. And one day, I would not be leaving again. My ancestors were truly a strong, courageous, and determined people to have survived that Holocaust, but they had warmly received me. As I slowly made my way back to the group, I reflected on my experience in the dungeon. There was no question I would be returning next time with Ben. As I grew near the group, it was startling. The expression on everyone's face was the same, sorrowful and angry. We would never forget this day. When we were leaving the castle, the receptionist asked her to sign the visitor's book, which we sadly but gratefully did, for we had just made history in returning home to the land of our ancestors, the first in our family to return. I wrote in the book on August 30th, 1987. The story is yet to be told. I praise God for returning me to the land of my ancestors. There is much work to be done. The spirit of the ancestors moves within these walls and touches my soul. Praise God. One of the things that also occurred was that when the guide took us to the door of no return, we asked him to open that door. And he said, but that door has not been opened in years. And we insisted, but we have returned. We want to walk through that door. We want our ancestors to know that we have, in fact, returned. Well, the guide reluctantly, but then anxiously, opened that door, which had not been opened in many years. And as we walked out, there was a mist that was on the ocean. There was a mist that covered us. It was like hands that touched us and said, welcome home, for you have in fact returned through the door of no return. That door was ultimately renamed years later with the return of ancestors from the Caribbean and from Brooklyn, New York, with Samuel Carson, the grand uncle of our brother Carson. And today, 35 years later, it has still remained the door of return, as thousands upon thousands of us return to the land of our ancestors. After our visit to the Cape Coast Castle dungeons, most of us were wiped out, so we returned to our hotel to chill out for a while. I was too keyed up to sleep, but didn't feel like talking, so I found a quiet place on the wall outside my room. As I sat there with the misty spray from the ocean wetting my face, I couldn't help thinking how angry these waters of the Atlantic Ocean were. They literally roared and thundered, the waves looking like billowing clouds or an avalanche of snow as the waters crashed against the shores of the route of the transatlantic Arab-European slave trade. Angry, crying, screaming, heart-wrenching anger. The Gulf of Guinea, the Gold Coast. When I think about it, it's like yesterday, something that is etched in my mind that will never be forgotten. We are Africans not because we are born in Africa, but because Africa is born in us. Look around you and behold us in one greatness. Greatness is an African possibility, and you can make it yours. We good?
Maybe because it's getting to be dark, we can continue tomorrow with the next chapter.
All right. So, good folks, as darkness descends upon us, I'm going to close for now. We will start again tomorrow because there is no place like home. Peace.